All right, everyone, let's get started for today. Thank you all for joining us for today's session of the Arab-Israeli conflict course. Today's session will focus in on the P.L.O, Fighting and Terror, Peace with Egypt, and the First Lebanon War. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. CWB offers unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. At CWB, we pride ourselves in offering a series of comprehensive learning opportunities with a breadth and depth of content that is both timely and timeless. Over the past 23 months, we have offered a wide array of virtual community programs to engage with experts on topics relating to Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, genocide, and hate. Thank you for being part of our community of learners. If you would like to make a donation to support our programming, please visit our website to donate online. It is always, as always, my honor to introduce Avi Ben-Hur, our scholar in residence. Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, and Greece. Please send any questions you may have directly to Avi via the chat feature. He will do his best to answer all of them after his presentation. And with that, Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome to everybody. Hope everybody can hear me. Just nod your heads yes or no if you can or cannot hear me. Great. All right. So just a little correction of what Ellen said. The last session, last session feels like it was a long time ago. What I covered in the last session included peace with Egypt. I'll just remind you, we actually finished up with the peace treaty with Egypt. So we're not going to be covering that today. The main focus today is going to be on continuing the saga of P.L.O. And I'll remind you that we also dealt in the last session with the P.L.O's attempted coup d'etat to take over the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in September 1970. And ultimately, King Hussein of Jordan prevailed. And Arafat and his cronies got the heave-ho and were kicked out of Jordan and ended up in southern Lebanon. That's where we left things, and we're going to take off from there. And the idea today is we're going to take that forward through the First Lebanon War of 1982, and we'll also take that to the First Intifada, which begins in 1987. So that's on our agenda today. Slightly different from what was presented, just because I saw that we had gotten actually more done in the previous session. So without further ado, let us begin. Oh, there's one more thing. Sorry. So in the last two sessions, I was actually able to embed some very good, I think, pretty good quality documentary footage inside the PowerPoints. Actually, I'm having a technical glitch with that right now. So what I'm going to do, with your permission, is I'm going to toggle back and forth between my PowerPoint presentation and some of the video clips. It's not going to be perfect. If I see it doesn't work well, I'll just jettison it, but we'll try anyway, because I think that the responsive guys, that people enjoy some of those clips. So without further ado, let's run forward. I'll remind you that the last thing we talked about vis-a-vis Arafat and the P.L.O. is actually that they find themselves regrouping themselves in southern Lebanon in 1970 after they're going to be kicked out of Jordan. Actually, I think that at no point did I explain to everybody here when and how the P.L.O. was established. Yasser Arafat was not the first head of the P.L.O. The P.L.O. was actually established in the Gaza Strip under the auspices of the Egyptian military occupation in 1964. That's very important because 1964, as you know, is 3 years before 1967, meaning it is 3 years before Israel is going to capture the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and so on and so forth. Okay, which means that the P.L.O. was established to eradicate Israel within the Green Line. I'm putting that out there for you because with the old adage of it's the economy, stupid. So let's go back and say, it's not the 6 Day War, stupid. It's about 48. Okay, and that's important to keep in mind. Be that as it may, we're now going back to 1970. Arafat and his cronies are going to step into the Lebanese quagmire. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that Lebanon, which then and today is a mosaic of different religious ethnic groups that have historically not necessarily got along in a very mountainous terrain. It's a tiny country, it's smaller than Israel, but it's very mountainous, which means that different ethnic groups can actually control small geographic areas if they have the topographical high ground. And as I said, historically, they have not necessarily gotten along. Lebanon is not really an historical place in the sense that there never was a Lebanon as a country before it was created artificially by the French and the British in the 20th century. There's Lebanon in the Bible, and Lebanon is a territory, but there was no Lebanese kingdom, empire. Lebanon was always part of a greater Syria, part of a greater Iraq, part of something much, much bigger. It's just too small a country for it to have actually been something independent. I'm saying that because it's a bit of an anomaly. I'm not trying to say we should cancel Lebanon and tell them to go home, but I'm saying that it's an artificial construct. In any event, be that as it may, Lebanon suffered 2 civil wars in the 20th century. The first one took place in the 1950s, but the second one, which is more to our point, is going to begin in 1975, and it's going to last for about 15 years. In other words, it's going to incursions in Lebanon, what we call the First Lebanon War, we Israelis call that, in 1982. There's going to be a civil war, and the Palestinians enter into a very unstable environment where they were able actually to, because they're armed, they're able to carve out their own enclaves and their own power or focal power there, and they're going to become a player in Lebanon. And this, of course, within itself is going to be a problem. But before we get to that, and they said in 1975, the civil war breaks out, and the Palestinians, the P.L.O, I should say, become players. I want to talk about some of the activity, the terror activity that's taking place, that's emanating, I should say, from Lebanon. In other words, in different terms, we did speak about Palestinian terror that was being projected from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, starting from 1967 until 1970, with the P.L.O attacking Israel, okay, from Jordan. But starting from 1970, the P.L.O is going to start to launch attacks against Israel from southern Lebanon. There are too many attacks for me to recount them all, but I will point out at least one prominent one, which should stick in some of your minds. It should jog some of your memory. In 1974, Palestinian terrorists managed to enter into Israel via the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. They landed on the beaches. The first thing they did was they actually murdered an Israeli Arab citizen. Okay, and then they went on to murder a family, a couple, and their 4-year-old child. They made their way inland to a place that's known as Ma'alot. Ma'alot is in the Upper Galilee, so it's not that far from Lebanese border. And what they do in Ma'alot, in addition to murdering this family, this couple, and this 4-year-old, is they actually gain control of a school. Ironically, this was like a holiday or something, and there were students from the Israeli city of Tzfat who were actually sleeping in this school in Ma'alot. They're using it almost as a hostel, and they were caught there with their teachers. And at the end of the day, what we're looking at here is that 23 students were murdered, teachers were murdered. This was a huge national trauma. Israeli commandos managed to storm it and kill the terrorists at the end of the day. But this was a huge national trauma. And one of the results of this national trauma, and this is something that all of you who've been to Israel have noticed, and now I'm explaining to the phenomenon, whenever you see school trips in Israel, or whenever you see Jewish youth coming from the States who are touring in Israel, they always have armed guards with them. That's actually a demand from the state. One of the things that happened as a response to this massacre in Ma'alot in 1974, from that moment on, every single school trip in Israel must be accompanied by an armed guard who also knows how to do first aid, basic first aid. And that was extrapolated to include all what they call educational groups that come from, let's say, abroad. So birthright groups have to have an armed guard, and so on and so forth. Not every single tourist enters the country, but youth groups, what they call educational groups, have to have an armed guard. And this is a response as a result to this national trauma. So throughout the 70s, starting from 1970 forward, we're going to have a series of very violent terror attacks that emanate from southern Lebanon, that the P.L.O is going to be committing against Israel. And things get so out of hand that in 1978, Israel embarks on an operation that nobody remembers. It was called the Litani operation. And I don't know if any of you guys remember this. This takes place in 1978. The Israeli army actually goes into southern Lebanon and goes, if you take a look at the map I put up over here, this dark blue line is the Israeli-Lebanese frontier. Please note, I did not say border. Okay, this blue line is running along the international border that was created in 1923, 1924 between French mandate Lebanon and British mandate Palestine. But a border is a line that the states that sit on it accept as an international border. Israel accepts this international border. Lebanon did not, until today does not. So, be that as it may, Israel is going to advance from this darker line, from the international border that was established in 1923-24, 5 kilometers north. That's about less than 3 miles north to the Litani River. If you look how the Litani River meanders, you'll notice that Israel's northernmost town, which is called Metula, which is right over here, is actually fairly close. It's not 5 kilometers, it's much, much closer to the Litani River. It's meandering. But most of the Israeli border is about 5 kilometers away. And the idea was that the P.L.O was pushed north of Litani River. And this gave us quiet for a little bit, but the P.L.O managed to procure Katyusha rockets that actually could be shot from north of the Litani River and were entering into North Israel. And so this became a nuisance again. And we had some more terror attacks that are going to ensue. In 1980, for example, 2 years later, Palestinian terrorists, P.L.O, will infiltrate the northern border around this area here, Misgav Am. Okay, where my cursor is, this is the kibbutz, and they killed 2 children and the caretaker. They broke into a children's home. They murdered 2 kids and the caretaker. This is 1980. So the fact we pushed them north of the Litani River, that was very, very temporary. This is 1980, I just mentioned. And by the time we get to 1982, things are heating up again. But now let's take a step back with your permission, because I want to talk about what's going on with the P.L.O in Lebanon. And for that purpose, I'm going to toggle. I'm going to stop sharing now for a moment. I'm going to toggle with the original video and see if we can make this happen. As I mentioned, if this doesn't work, then we will not do this, but we will try it nonetheless. So here goes. I hope this works. It'd be nice to see where the start button is. Here we go. Okay.
In April 1975,
can you all hear?
Civil war broke out
you guys
in Lebanon,
hear or not?
and Arafat became a force to be reckoned with. He asked for a meeting with Jamal at the Christian clan leader's headquarters. As Arafat drove through Beirut, it was clear that the Christians considered him an enemy.
We drove past slogans on the walls saying no to the P.L.O. He laughed and said to me, "We must do something about this, or Lebanon will explode."
The civil war escalated.
Avi, I think it stopped.
Sorry about that.
We are going
here we go.
to accept in the future that any war can be waged
We back on?
from Lebanon, from the Lebanon borders, because this and the past experience has proved it, this will prove disastrous for them.
Arafat ignored the warning. 1974 had seen a succession of Palestinian raids across the border into Israel. In one attack, 18 Israelis, including 8 children, died. A month later, Palestinian raiders took over a school and killed 22 children. Israel's main anti-terrorist efforts shifted along with the P.L.O attacks. Now the Jordanian border was quiet, and there was fighting on the Lebanese border.
I was appointed commander of a brigade on the Lebanese border. All our efforts were aimed at preventing terrorist infiltration. Hardly a week passed without 2 or 3 attempts to cross the border.
Israel, surrounded by hostile Muslim states, badly needed allies. When Lebanon's Christians were challenged by the Palestinians and Lebanese Muslims, they asked for Israel's help. Defense Minister Shimon Peres sent an Arabic-speaking officer on a secret mission to Beirut.
In my heart, I decided that such a man must volunteer. His life would certainly be at risk.
And when I told him I was willing, he smiled. He said, "It's very dangerous." I said, "I know."
I saw Fuad's mission as a trip to a minefield, a place where there are many traitors.
The Israeli officers set off aboard a missile boat, sailing in darkness towards civil war-torn Beirut.
All Beirut was lit by cannon fire. A city like hell. Unbelievable. One big conflagration.
The intelligence officer knew that the Christians were faring badly against the Palestinians. His Christian hosts sped him towards the battlefront.
Suddenly, I saw thousands of people lining the road and clapping. I said to my host, "What's this?" He said, "Let's take a look." Then I see 2 trucks coming up. One truck has men shooting in the air. The other has ropes tied to it. At the end of each of these ropes is the body of a P.L.O. terrorist. And this truck is dragging them along the ground. And the men on the back of the truck are just shooting and shooting at them, although they had long been dead. I was simply shocked.
Lebanese Muslims and Christians and Palestinians fought and murdered each other with ferocity. Some 40,000 would die on both sides. A British journalist reported, "At its most hideous, this civil war has been simple. Muslims have murdered Christians, Christians have murdered Muslims. Not in battle, but in cold blood." These men were innocents, kidnapped in the street, taken to a secret place, tortured, shot, and then dumped in the street again for their families to find. The Israeli intelligence officer confirmed deep anti-P.L.O. feeling among the Christians. They desperately needed help.
They asked us for weapons, everything. Rifles, Kalashnikovs, Uzis. They asked for cannons. We gave them. Mortars and tanks. We gave them.
Okay, interesting as that was, I want to go back to the PowerPoint with your permission. So we'll see if how well this works, ladies and gentlemen. Look, it was important for me to show this to you because I think we've forgotten just how brutal Lebanon is and was. And you see the shock on this officer. By the way, when he's being interviewed there on this documentary, he's already a very senior Israeli politician. By the way, he's no longer with us. He died a few years ago, and he almost became president. But there were corruption things were found about him. But be that as it may, you see the shock that this is like a totally different world. The Israelis don't even know this world. This is something very, very different. And this is important, folks, because Ariel Sharon, who we're going to talk about in a moment, who was the architect of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, did not really understand what Lebanon was. He didn't understand, first of all, the demographic balance. And this is important because Lebanon in the 1920s and 30s had a Christian majority. But when you go to the late 1970s or mid 70s, the Christians are no longer the majority there. There are bigger groups that are hostile to them. They actually do not have the power to get over on the other groups there. And Israel was essentially stepping into a quagmire. It was stepping into quicksand without realizing just how deep we're stepping into the quicksand. We chose the only allies there that we thought we could ally, who had mutual interests with us to a certain extent. In other words, the bottom line you heard there, how much these Christians hated the P.L.O, and of course Israel hated the P.L.O. So you have a strong ally there. But what we didn't really understand was just how weak they were. It's not a question of motivation, it's a question of capacity. And they really did not have the capacity because Arafat was teaming up with Sunnis. And anyway, to put it briefly, Sharon misread the map, the demographic map and the reality in Lebanon. That having been said, what I'm showing you here, I'm projecting you right now, is the fact that Ariel Sharon himself is going to, as Minister of Defense, under a Begin government starting from 1981, Ariel Sharon is going to go to Lebanon, an enemy state, and he's going to meet with the most charismatic, significant, and serious Christian phalangist Lebanese leader, Bashir Jamal. That's the person you're looking at that he's talking to. And Ariel Sharon is going to cook up a plan with this young man that Israel is going to invade Lebanon, is going to basically kick out the P.L.O. And the assumption is that the Christian phalangists will be able to take over Beirut. There'll be an election, and they will be essentially, Sharon will be a kingmaker. And next step will be that Lebanon will make peace with Israel. A Christian Lebanon will make peace with Israel. This is like a grand strategy that had no connection to reality. But this was Ariel Sharon's plan. The problem was he did not share this plan with his prime minister. This was his own plan. He didn't share it with his cabinet, didn't share it with his prime minister. This is his own private plan, which he cooked up together with the chief of staff of the IDF. So here we have to take a step back and understand what's happening politically in Israel and what's happening in the region at large. Number one, Begin is going to be reelected in 1981, and there's going to be a shuffling of the deck in terms of his ministers. He had two moderate ministers in his previous cabinet who were a moderating force. One was Moshe Dayan, and the other one was Ezra Weizmann. Both of them are going to leave his government because they feel like he's not fulfilling everything that he had promised vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And in lieu of them, instead, he's going to get two hardliners. Ariel Sharon will be installed as Minister of Defense, and Yitzhak Shamir is going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs. So you're going to have a much more hawkish government starting from 1981. And as I mentioned, Sharon has got his own agenda, and he basically deceives the other cabinet members of what his real plans are, keeps them very close to his chest, and he tells Begin that they can go into Lebanon no more than 45 kilometers, and they'll be able to vanquish the P.L.O. And each time it became another step and another step. He didn't say to him that he planned to go all the way to Beirut. Now there was another player in Lebanon we're going to have to relate to in a few moments, Syria. But before we do that, let's understand what's happening regionally. And again, it's going to be a walk down memory lane for many of you. 1979, we're back in the Cold War, big time. It heats up after several years of détente. The Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan, and they start getting heavily involved in Central and South America against American interests. Same year, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, what was essentially an allied Muslim state, the Iran under the Shah, which, by the way, had excellent relations with the state of Israel as well, but had really good relations with the United States, is going to be taken over by Shiite fundamentalists, who we have until today. And so regionally, the deck is being reshuffled as well. I'll remind you that within a year, Saddam Hussein in Iraq is going to initiate a war, an 8-year war with Iran, which used chemical weapons against the Iranians. This is also happening in the region. In 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty, which means that Israel's biggest enemy is off the table. In other words, in the timing here, the context, the timing is very important. 1982, the superpowers are involved in their own issues. You have the Iran-Iraq war going on. Syria is having serious problems with Turkey. And Ariel Sharon sees an opportunity. The excuse is going to be the attempted failed assassination by the P.L.O. of the Israeli ambassador to London. They didn't manage to kill him, they managed to very, very badly injure him. And this is the pretext for what was called here Operation Peace for the Galilee, but we now in Israel, everybody calls it today the First Lebanon War, because we had a second one in 2006. In any event, Begin was convinced by Sharon this was feasible, but Sharon, as I said, had other plans, and those plans included doing a big makeover in Lebanon. Let's just take a look here at the sequence of what's going to take place in this war. June 6th, Israel invades Lebanon. Let me take you once again down memory lane, ladies and gentlemen. Remember what happened the same summer at the same time? The Falkland War. Remember, you had this really stupid, strange war between the UK and Argentina over the Falklands, also known by the Argentinians. Why Argentinians? You have to put this in. Malvinas, okay? These islands that are like in the middle of nowhere, which are actually much closer geographically to Argentina, but this was Thatcher, and they're going to, this is the British Empire, blah, blah, blah. And so you had this other war, which is engaging a lot of people in the news cycle, by the way, for some time. It just got, I think it finished faster than this one did. In any event, you can see this is going to be quite quick. Israel invades Lebanon on the 6th of June. But guess what? Within 3 days, Israel finds itself fighting against Syria. So here you need to understand that Syria controlled, for several years already at that point, controlled politically and to a certain extent militarily, large parts of Lebanon. And this is another miscalculation. We did not expect the Syrians to respond the way they did. The first thing that's going to happen is we're going to shoot down 86 MiGs. And I'm sure you guys remember this as well. Those remember, it was like amazing. We had these dogfights. Not a single Israeli warplane was shot down. We shot down 86 Syrian MiGs. That's like an insane amount of planes being shot down in one day, okay, with no losses on the Israeli side. But you're also going to have at the same time some very heavy tank battles taking place between Israel and Syria. And here, I would say that at the end of the day, the Syrians withdrew, but they also captured at least two Israeli tanks with their teams. And this was not a rout on our part. They decided to stop engaging us, but that was much more difficult battles than we had expected. Be that as it may, within 3 days, we now begin to encircle Beirut. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen The Princess Bride, where it says there over and over again, never fight a land war in Asia, which is a bad joke about the United States fighting first the Korean War and then the Vietnamese War, meaning it's an axiom the United States should not get involved in a land war in Asia, although we keep repeating that itself over and over again. The Israeli version of that is we should never capture or enter an enemy Arab capital. That was an axiom that Israel adhered to until 1982. In 1982, we basically encircled Beirut. We captured the international airport. We broke our own unspoken rule, and we paid a fairly heavy price for that. We ended up bombarding a lot of the city. I think that, I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but 1982 is a big turning point in terms of Israel's public relations, in terms of how the world perceived Israel. And I mean to say that there were plenty of countries that it's perceived us and plenty of audiences that perceived us much more positively. That soured. The war in 82 was the first souring of how Israel was viewed. Israel was viewed more of a bully. This is no longer David versus Goliath. We are now the Goliath. And of course, the first Intifada, which we're going to get to today as well, is going to be the knockout punch in terms of our PR. Be that as it may, After bombardment, after a lot of negotiations, after Philip Habib, who's doing shuttle diplomacy in the United States, an agreement is signed on the 23rd of August that Arafat's going to have to, and his people have to leave Lebanon. And that, in fact, transpires on the 30th of August. 15,000 men with Arafat to get on ships and sail to Tunis. They left a few thousand there, but they took most of the people with them. So Sharon's plan seems to be working very well. And then within 2 weeks, Bashar Jamal, who was supposed to be the new president, a Christian president of Lebanon. Remember, this is the plan. He's going to become president, and then he's going to make a peace treaty with Israel. On the 14th of September, he is going to be assassinated. They basically drop a building on his head, literally drop a building on his head. And the Phalanx response is going to be to blame the Palestinians for this. And 2 days later, they're going to commit a major massacre on hundreds of Palestinian civilians. Okay, so now let me try once again to show you some film footage with your permission. We'll see if this works.
In 1981, Ariel Sharon
You guys can
became
hear it?
Israel's defense minister.
Good.
Soon after, the Christian leaders came to a Beirut beach to await a visitor.
As I landed, Bashir Jamal came towards me. He hugged me, shook my hand. He had his officers with him.
Bashir, the son of Christian leader Pierre Jamal, now controlled the weapons supplied by Israel. He had ruthlessly eliminated his rivals and united all the Christian forces under his command. Sharon, at a meeting with the Christian leaders, revealed a plan to root out the Palestinians.
فقال للقادة المسيحيين علموا
He told the Christian leaders, "We have taken a decision in Israel to invade Lebanon.
باجتياح لبنان القرار متخذ وإننا ننتظر الفرصة لتنفيذ هذا الاجتياح."
Sharon told the Christians they would have to help. Israel's troops could not march into an Arab capital. Expelling the Palestinians from the city would be the task of the Christians.
I said, "Remember, if an invasion happens, it's a mission you will have to carry out."
Okay, folks. So wait a minute. Okay. So, best laid plans of mice and men. As I mentioned before, things did not go exactly the way Sharon was hoping. And by the way, while the war is taking place, we have a phenomenon, which is the first time ever phenomenon in Israeli history, which was that we began to find not just enlisted men, but also Israeli officers, and not all of them junior officers, raising question marks about what this was about. Because as we began to advance towards Beirut, all the time the wars are changing, and it appeared to people that this was a war of choice and not an existential war whatsoever for Israel. And there was a sense that what we were doing there was not necessarily the moral and right thing to do. What I'm trying to tell you now is that one of the results of this war, and it already started during the war, was the beginning of conscientious objection. We had a very, very talented tank commander, battalion commander, who gave up his commission during the war. He said, "I'm not doing this. This is morally wrong. Court-martial me. You lied to us. You said we're going to 45 kilometers. Why are we now shelling? Why am I shelling Beirut with my battalion, with my tanks on the civilian population? This is not what we signed up for. This is not what we do." And so this is not everybody, but this became very, very famous because this was something that never happened before during a war. I'm not talking about after the Yom Kippur War, where you're going to have a lot of demonstrations by people who fought and felt that the government had not done the right thing, and they were very angry about the way the government and the military had reported itself. That's something else. That's after the war. I'm talking about during a war. We've never had a situation where you had officers who stand up and say, and that's not everybody, but we had enough of it as it became a phenomenon that were already having issues, taking issue in a big way, okay, with what they're being asked to do. And so this takes place the first time during this war. And as I mentioned, what's going to happen is that ultimately the Christian phalangists are going to enter 2 refugee camps. And let me see if I can get this on film, because it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to get the exact place, but I'm going to try nonetheless, with your permission. See if this works. Second. Oops. Whoa. Let's try this again. Let's see if this works.
Get out.
Wait a minute.
Leave it.
No, we're not there.
Just now, he said, you are inviting us for a meeting. Said, please.
In the last days of August 1982,
Okay.
thousands of Palestinian fighters were forced to evacuate Beirut.
Nearly 15,000 men expelled from Beirut. This was unprecedented. An entire terrorist organization expelled from a capital.
Then, in a massive explosion at his party headquarters, Bashir Gemayel, Lebanon's president-elect and Israel's ally, was assassinated. The Israeli defense minister became convinced that Palestinian fighters were still operating in Beirut.
They left behind at least 2,000 armed men. It was clear that once the city was united, it would be necessary to take action against them.
Christian militiamen sought vengeance for the death of Gemayel. While Israeli troops stood by, providing light from flares, the phalangists entered the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila. There were no P.L.O. fighters there. They found only old men, women, and children, and slaughtered them.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
I am not here to explain this horrible tragedy. It belongs to a world of dark motives, not our world. Only those who carried it out can be blamed for this massacre. I hope they will be punished.
Okay. So, of course, they're not going to be punished, but Ariel Sharon is going to be punished. Because what's going to happen is, when this comes in the news, into the news feed in Israel, you're going to have the largest demonstration in Israel's history, where, according to the news then, at the time, and this demonstration took place in what today is called Rabin Square, same place where Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in Tel Aviv, but this is years before that. According to news reports at the time, 400,000 people came to demonstrate. Just by way of context, Israel had 4 million citizens at that moment. That means 10% of the citizens demonstrated, demanding an answer. And a blue ribbon commission of inquiry was set up, and which found Ariel Sharon to be indirectly responsible. You remember that clip that I showed in the beginning with Fuad, who was describing how the Christian phalangists were dragging dead bodies of P.L.O. members and they were shooting into their bodies for fun? He gave that. If you can read the Khan Commission transcripts. I've read them, and he gave the same testimony there that you saw here, and the judges on the commission said you should have known who you were dealing with. They said to Sharon, these aren't people you didn't know. if you know these are the way they behave there, you should have known who you're dealing with over there. And he basically had to leave his position as Minister of Defense, and it was determined that he can never ever be Minister of Defense in the future, which is great. This is now we're talking here 1983 or 1982, 1983. As you know, in 2002, he became Prime Minister. So he wasn't Defense Minister, he was the Prime Minister from 2002 to 2005. Okay. So Sharon was in the political wilderness for some time. But in any event, the events of Sabra Shatila were jarring and a shocking events for the state of Israel. And again, as I've mentioned previously, this is actually one of the things. This was a knockout punch in terms of public relations, in terms of how the world began to perceive Israel in a very, very negative light. We're going to talk more in a subsequent session about Lebanon. One of the, how shall I put it, unintended consequences of our invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was the fact that we basically, to a certain extent, created the Hezbollah. What does that mean? It means that when we invaded Lebanon in 82, Hezbollah didn't exist. It was created as a response of Israel's invasion and us sitting in Lebanon for 18 years. It was created by Iran as a proxy to attack us. That was the purpose from an Iranian perspective. You had Amal, which was a Shiite organization that was actually talking to us and working with us for a short while, and they were totally weakened by Hezbollah, which took over. But one of the unintended consequences that we ended up getting a much, much worse enemy in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, than the P.L.O. ever was, because that enemy was supported by a regional power, meaning the Iranians. And we're going to talk more about that, as I said, in a future session. I'll just say in brackets right now, if you want to look around our immediate region, the most serious strategic threat that faces Israel today comes from Hezbollah in Lebanon. I will explain that in a subsequent session right now. Okay, so let's just continue forward from this point. You also, I'm showing you this is a protest poster in Hebrew by an organization that was formed during the war called Yesh Gvul, which means there's a limit. There's a limit, okay? And it says there, the poem that's written there in Hebrew says, come attack us, airplane, take us to Lebanon. We'll fight for Sharon, and we'll come back in coffins. It all rhymes, by the way, so it doesn't translate well into English. But basically, this is a protest movement that was created as a response to this war. Okay, and this now brings us to what I'd like to finish up with today. Okay, which is the outbreak of the first Intifada. So this war takes place in 1982. Arafat and his cronies are kicked out to Tunis. They're out of the region for the first time. They're literally out of the region. Between 1967 and 1987, Israel created what was for us a symbiotic economic relationship with the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We were becoming a post-industrial economy, and they were supplying cheap labor, because as you know, post-industrial economies, it's very expensive. Labor is very expensive. So they were supplying cheap labor. They were getting what for them was a good salary, or a good enough salary, or maybe not a good enough salary, but they were getting salaries. They were getting work, and we were getting cheap labor. This symbiotic relationship was good for us. It wasn't necessarily good for them. In any event, what's going to be taking place around 1986 were semi-secret negotiations between Shimon Peres, who was the foreign minister. We actually had a rotation government. We had a very strange national unity government where there was these two-year rotations. I don't know if you guys remember this, where Shamir was prime minister for 2 years and Peres was his foreign minister, and then Peres was prime minister and Shamir. Okay, and anyway, so Shimon Peres was holding semi-secret talks with King Hussein of Jordan to actually come up with a good solution, which would be a confederated solution where the Jordanians would retake over politically the West Bank and take the Palestinians under their auspices and under their patronage, with Israel's acquiescence as part of a general peace agreement that would take place publicly between Israel and Jordan. Okay, this is called the London Agreements. And while Peres was pushing forward very hard to make this happen, and George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State at the time, was also making this happen as a mediator, Yitzhak Shamir, who was very right-wing and very untrusting, was doing everything he could to undermine this. And basically, Shamir, deep-sixed this. But as I said, it was semi-secret. And the Palestinians were realizing that they're being shunted aside again, that the Jordanians can be taking over. This is just as a regional context, which I think is important for you to understand. In 1987, to be more specific, in December 1987, some Israeli Jews will be murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And within a day or two, you're going to have a car accident where there was a vehicle that lost control and was swerving in the direction of an Israeli military vehicle to get out of the way of this oncoming vehicle that was hurtling towards it. It pulled to the side, also lost control, went up on the sidewalk and ran over and killed 8 Palestinian workers. The Palestinians read into this as a revenge attack for the Israelis that had been murdered by the terrorists. And this is actually the immediate spark, contextual spark, of the outbreak of the so-called First Intifada. So what does Intifada mean? Intifada in Arabic means to shake off. Okay, it doesn't literally mean uprising. It means to shake off. In this case, to shake off means to shake off Israeli rule or Israeli occupation, as they saw it. Okay, we translate into English, okay, as an uprising, which in all intents and purposes it was. And what has to be said here is that, to all intents and purposes, this first Palestinian uprising, or first Intifada, and look at this photo over here. And doesn't that photo remind you of a different photo that took place the same years in 1989? I'm thinking Tiananmen. I'm thinking about the guy with the 2 shopping bags standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen. Please nod your heads if you know what I'm talking about. By the way, I was there in 88, 1 year before that broke out. I mean in China, I don't mean here. I was actually here where this kid is when this was taking place. But I was in 88, I was actually in Tiananmen, okay? And here, this is an iconic photo, and this photo says it all, right? Talk about Israel's public relations, okay? Talk about David and Goliath. But here's the thing, guys. The truth is that for the most part, as violent as this uprising was, it was mostly civil disobedience. We're talking about primarily rock throwing, which can kill people, okay, but doesn't necessarily have to be lethal. We're talking about throwing Molotov cocktails. That can definitely kill people. But we're not talking about a lot of shooting incidents. We're not talking about that. And this posed a very, very big challenge to Israel. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the army is not trained to put down civil disobedience. The army is not trained to be policemen. The army is trained to use lethal force against another foreign army, right? You're not supposed to use lethal force against civilians. In any event, the army was not trained to police. I'm speaking to you now both historically and historically, meaning I'm telling you this is a reality back then, and I'm telling you as somebody who participated in this. And when I say I participated in it, I started my first degree, my BA, 1 minute after the outbreak of this Intifada. I finished my regular army service 6 months before this broke out, and I began my first degree in Hebrew University 6 months after it broke out. Which means that my entire first degree, I did reserve duty in the Intifada, which in very simple terms means I was doing this stuff, what you're seeing over here. Not exactly this stuff, but very, very similar situation that you're seeing right now. Okay, and the Minister of Defense at the time was Yitzhak Rabin. And I put a quote, he said, break their bones. Rabin says this in 1987, 88. Guys, follow the bouncing ball. And 6 years later, he is on the White House lawn shaking hands with Arafat at the beginning of the Oslo Accords. So this in terms of the trajectory and how fast things are going to be moving here and changing here, just to give you a little bit of context here. And in a second, I'm going to finish up, so I want to open up to questions. I know you guys sent a lot to chat. This so-called first Palestinian Intifada is going to last from December 1987, and it's going to be petering out by around 1990, 1991, with the first Gulf War. We really did not know how to deal with this. And again, the army was being asked to police the civilian population and to put down a civil disobedience. And we did not do it well because we weren't trained to do it. And this again, also, these scenes were seen on Israeli TV screens. You saw your father or your son or your brother doing this kind of stuff. Okay, so we didn't really know how to deal with this. This was not directed from above. This was grassroots. It bubbled up from below. And then Arafat and his people from Tunis tried to control this from the outside. And I should say not that successfully. So without further ado, I'm stopping the session right now. Not the session, but I'm stopping the talking now. And I'm going to check out lots of chats were sent to me. Start seeing what we've got over here. Okay, here we go. So I was asked a question here about what kind of public statements did the P.L.O. make in the wake of attacking civilians, terror, acts of terror, and so on and so forth. Look, I can't tell you very specifically with that, but I can tell you what the general response usually of Hamas, of the P.L.O., of Hezbollah. Well, all Israelis serve in the army. They're legitimate targets. All Israelis are soldiers. They don't distinguish between civilians and military personnel, number one. Number two, they'll say, hey, look what the Israelis doing to our civilian population. They're harming children. They're harming, it's tit for tat. They're getting back what they did to us. Okay, this would be their kind of responses. What is the name of the documentary we've been watching? Okay, the cat's out of the bag. This is a PBS documentary, which is a very old one. You can tell, which I think came out in 98 or 99. And the name of it, you can download it from YouTube and watch it, the whole thing. It's actually, I think it's very, very well done. It's called The 50 Years War. So 1948 to 1998, the 50 Years War. That's why 98 is jumping out here. What's very good about this documentary, which is not something you've experienced here with me, but I'll share with you, is that particularly, well, one of the things you have seen, a lot of the players, whether it's the generals or it's the heads of state or players, okay, of different countries here are actually speaking to the camera. So that's also interesting. What's really interesting is they did this, they made this film in the 1990s. You still had people alive from 48, from the first war. And so you have footage of people who've long since passed away, where we got them. So that's very, very interesting, very important. And in my personal opinion, it's also a pretty balanced documentary. It's not anti-Israel, it's not pro-Israel. I think it's fairly balanced to my mind. Anyway, you may not agree. It's, by the way, it's quite a long documentary. I think it's like 4 hours, something like that, 4 or 5 hours. It's quite long. Okay, 45 kilometers is approximately, I'd say it's probably close to 30 miles, something like that. I'm being asked the question, was Iran present in Lebanon and Syria? First of all, Syria for sure not. Iran's going to be present in Syria only when you have the outbreak of the civil war in Syria in 2011. They don't get there in 2011. Iran's going to become more present there, maybe more like 2013 in Syria. But regarding Lebanon, Iran will be present in the sense of Hezbollah from 82 forward, not before that. Not before that. By the way, keeping in mind that the Islamic Revolution is 1979, you know, Iran is not around that long by 1982, and they're also deeply involved in the Iran-Iraq War, which is an 8-year war. The Iranians lost 150,000 soldiers Okay, that was, you guys have to, I think we've forgotten that. That was a pretty serious war. Okay. I'm being asked a question, had the London agreements worked? In other words, had Israel and Jordan gotten their act together in 1988, and you would have had this peace, would that have destabilized the Hashemite King of Jordan? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't deal with what ifs. I know what happened. I don't know what might have happened. And that may sound snide or snarky or cynical, but it's being honest. I don't know. I can't deal with what if questions. We know what happened. We don't know what might have happened. It's a tough call. Yes, there's an ethnic majority of Palestinians in Jordan, correct? Okay, and the monarchy always has to kind of really take care and watch itself. On the other hand, you know what? The economic benefits may have been so great that maybe it would have stabilized. So I can't play the what if game. I don't know. I'm being asked the question, how come the Palestinians were not using guns? There was some shooting, but there was relatively little shooting taking place, or even suicide bombings that you had in the second Intifada. How come they were not doing the first Intifada? This has nothing to do with resources. Look, in the Palestinian consciousness and in their narrative, the first Intifada was a nonviolent uprising. Well, with all due respect, rock throwing is violent, and so is Molotov cocktails. This is not a Gandhi model, okay, or Martin Luther King model, with all due respect. That would be nonviolent. And by the way, this was their biggest mistake. If the Palestinians here, I'm willing to, with my gut, say, I know I'm playing, I just said before I won't do a what if, but I suspect that I said it in real time. If the Palestinians in 87, in 88, had pulled a Gandhi on us or pulled a Martin Luther King on us, they would have made great strides. Because if they would have come there unarmed and put their kids and women forward and just march, block roads, okay, but really nonviolent demonstrations, what would have happened was we would have collapsed. We would have backed down. That was then. That's not what would happen now. What I just said would have happened in 87 would not happen in 2022. That I can tell you for sure, that I know. Because we've also changed as a society, okay? And things have happened since. But in those years, in 87, 88, had the Palestinians really done nonviolent demonstrations, the way I think a normal person would call nonviolence, okay? Not throwing rocks and not throwing Molotov cocktails, I think that Israel would have had extreme difficulty internally of suppressing that over time. I think that it would have forced us to go cope with them on a human level, but that's not what happened. So to their mind, again, not using weapons, they're doing a nonviolent uprising, but that's not really true. It was violent. And the truth also is, folks, that we were using some lethal weapons, certainly initially. We didn't even have non-lethal weapons initially. And when we got them, we didn't really know how to use them properly initially. I can say that from personal experience again. It took some time to learn that. And it's, you don't send an army to put down a civil disobedience. That's not what armies are trained for. That cannot end well. That really cannot end well. Okay, how are we doing here? Who is responsible for the Gemayel assassination? Well, Israel and the Phalangists blamed the Palestinians, blamed the P.L.O. I think today there are some serious academic voices that are pointing fingers in other directions as well. Okay, that are saying maybe footprint of one of the first actions, maybe of the Hezbollah. I want to remind you that in 1983, Hezbollah, 83? I think in 82 or 83, Hezbollah is going to bomb the Marine barracks, and the same day bomb the French paratroopers and kill over 240 U.S. Marines and kill, I don't remember, tens of French paratroopers. So Hezbollah was already starting to get active, and today there are some voices that think that it wasn't actually P.L.O. that did it, but it may have been Hezbollah, who had an interest also in ensuring that you didn't have a Christian Lebanese government. In any event, we're not 100% sure about it. It would certainly fit in their modus operandi, as we know later on. Okay, we saw them do it later on. That's what Hezbollah. In this case, it's not entirely clear. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to meet, I guess, in another month, and we will continue this journey together. And we'll be dealing with taking it closer and closer to our time. I hope it was fruitful. I hope you enjoyed. Hope everybody is healthy.
Fantastic. So I will close us out for today. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Avi, for today's session. I'll be sure to include the PBS documentary link in our follow-up email. We hope that you'll join us next Wednesday for our Sons post-film discussion with the film director, Avi Mayor Mazorik, and of course, it will be moderated by our own Avi Ben-Hur. The next event in this series will be session 9. We have 2 more in this series, and it will be entitled Israel and the Palestines, 1987 to 2021. I've already updated that information on our website, so you can see all the details there. To sign up for these programs and more, please visit our event page on our website, classroomswithoutborders.org/events. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.